But part of the thought process for Scully, I suspect, was that architectural history was a discipline that would be more amenable to his way of seeing the world than literature had been. But he could still use and would still use literary techniques, a literary approach. That's my point. So when we talk about Scully and language, we're really observing that architecture became, in a very real way, his literary material. It was his literary source, because he saw in architecture the power of great literature, and he chose to treat it that way, as something that affects us deeply and powerfully, and at its best, also as something that can teach us important lessons about how to live. We read great novels, after all, to be excited, to be engaged, to be moved, and to learn about life. Scully had us look at architecture for the same reasons. It is not just eloquence that marked his prose, but the drive to assemble words in a way that went beyond direct communication and would use the power of language itself, putting together words and sentences in all their magnificence and might and subtlety and grace, to put visual images before us and help us not just to comprehend them, but to feel them deeply and to think about what they mean for our lives. He wanted to use the power of language to awaken in his students an understanding of the power of art. Maybe that's the best way to put it. That unlike most art historians for whom language is just a tool, language was something more to Vincent Scully. I would not go so far as to say it was an end in itself, but there are moments when it seems to come close to that, when the language takes on the poetic quality of words that are about the form of language as well as about their nominal subject. We all know that art is, whatever else, at least in part about the idea of art. By the same token, great and poetic language is about the idea and form of language, and about what it can do and what it can mean. And in the case of Scully, how using language with the power of poetry can make us understand and feel the power of art and the power of architecture. That is a great, even transcendent thing. I don't know any historian of architecture who has treated words as Scully did. There are many, many examples, but I'll give you just a couple of them. One that I find particularly moving is this passage from The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods, at the end of the chapter on the Parthenon, in which Scully writes, "There is only being and light. Time lies dead in the white and silver light of the outdoor room between the Parthenon and the Erechtheion. It dies upon the Parthenon's white and golden columns, so that Athena takes her one step forward and outward forever. Gods and men alike are radiant in the light. It is the only immortality for human beings, approaching the hazard of the light with the gods in this illuminated instant, which is the whole of time. In the light, everything is simple and grave. The relation of the buildings to each other and to the land fuses in the white light. What remains is beyond action, too instantaneous for reverie, too deep for calm. It is silence, the sweet, deep breath taken. Time stops. Fear lies dead upon the rock. The column is, it stands. Time stops. Fear lies dead upon the rock. The column is, it stands. This is not descriptive writing, and it is not analytical writing. It is something beyond that, a kind of writing that engages so deeply with the form and meaning that, and I would even say with the sensuality of words, that we cannot but think of it in poetic terms. It is in every way ekphrasis, the use of rhetorical language to describe works of art. But so too with many more conventionally analytical sentences of Scully's, like this reference to Frank Lloyd Wright. In the splendid Clunley house, the separate pavilions were interwoven by long, heavily framed corridors, and the low ceilings sail on seemingly endlessly before the flat faces of the deeply embedded fireplace walls. It was a kind of freedom, and there being, as it were, no end to it. It was also a kind of death. Underneath everything, how great and terrible an architecture it was. We asked ourselves about the clients. Did they know what they had or what had swallowed them? What did the clients see here? What did they want it? Why did they want it? They saw peace, surely, and utter calm and dim quietness and warmth, and marvelous functional flexibility despite the general order. These things probably induced them to put up with some feeling of oppression and the occasional real darkness and the sense of an utterly competent leader directing it all. Or the reference to Bernard Maybach's Palace of the Fine Arts in San Francisco, with the low dome, Jefferson's domes, adrift on the Pacific at last. What a wonderful phrase that is. And how much is in it? Scully refers not only to Jefferson's favored low, Pantheon-like domes, but also implicitly to his connection to American expansion, to the growth of the nation across the continent. All these ideas, Jefferson's love of classicism and his belief in the manifest destiny of the United States to cross the continent, come together in that simple, elegant phrase, just 7 words, Jefferson's domes, adrift on the Pacific at last. And while we're on the subject of Bernard Maybach, Scully ends another essay by contrasting Maybach to the crafty Frank Lloyd Wright and describing him as one of the great innocents in every age, always free. I read that phrase decades ago, and its simple but slightly quirky syntax still resonates with me. It's more than about Maybach. It is about the very idea, the very meaning of innocence. I recall from my days as a student hearing Scully quote Robert Lowell's great poem for the Union Dead when he taught, going in the wrong direction here. There we are. When he taught about Auguste Saint-Gaudens' celebrated bas-relief of Robert Shaw's Civil War regiment in Boston Common. But I realized he wasn't just showing us how the sculptor had inspired this poem. He was showing us how Robert Lowell and so much other poetry had influenced him. That's what we're really seeing here. His own language was as fluent and as deeply in love with the form and sound and shape and meaning and juxtaposition of words as the poet's was. Scully wanted to be the poet of architecture, and that is what he became.